Hello and welcome once again to another episode of AP European History. This is the end of Unit 7, and this is all about the agreements that took place during World War II between the Allies and after World War II by the Allies. You can already see the disagreements that are starting to emerge that will end up being the Cold War, when we have on the one side Britain and the United States, for the most part, being Western capitalist democracies versus the totalitarian and communist or planned economy Soviet Union. Now, going all the way back to a period of time when the United States is not at war, there was kind of an unusual meeting that happened in August of 1941. Britain has been at war with Nazi Germany for quite a while, and the United States has not yet been pulled into the war. But there is a meeting off of the coast of Newfoundland in Canada between our President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Churchill. Military leaders also met at this point in time. They're meeting on ships off of the coast of Newfoundland, and they are talking about how the world will be after World War II is over. Once again, the United States is not in just yet. It's kind of an unusual thing to be talking about, and the situation seems rather dire, both for Britain and then also the Soviet Union, which is being attacked at this point in time and really losing greatly in this part of 1941. I'm not sure that you need to write all of this stuff down, and I hope that it reminds you of President Wilson's 14 points. But if you can just look through it with me, and I'll just kind of read off what we've got. They thought that at the end of the war there should be no territorial gains, and that the territorial adjustments that took place had to be in accordance with the wishes of the peoples concerned. In other words, this is kind of like a national self-determination, again from the 14 points. All peoples had the right to self-determination. They wanted to lower trade barriers. Sounds like the 14 points again. There was supposed to be global economic cooperation and the advancement of social welfare. And then freedom from want and freedom from fear. Freedom of the seas. That sounds once again like the 14 points. And more about the 14 points. The disarmament of aggressor nations. Not all nations, just the aggressor nations, and then a post-war common disarmament. I suppose that would be, of course, those peace-loving Western democracies for the most part. So this is really the first meeting that takes place even before the United States is in the war, and it doesn't include the Soviet Union because Stalin is very busy at this point in time trying to recover from his funk and actually fight back against them. A couple years down the road, there is a meeting of the Big Three. This is going to be the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. They meet in Tehran, which is in Persia or Iran. It's a place where all three leaders can get to. They also wanted to have the meeting there in order to keep Persia or Iran in more or less the Western influence or Western sphere and not go over to the Axis powers. Britain and the United States agreed to join or to create a Western Front in 1944, so that would take quite a bit of pressure off of the Soviet Union, which once again, even in 1943, was desperately fighting against the Nazis. They all three agreed to encourage Turkey to join the war. That effort was unsuccessful. Iran would be helped by all three, once again, to stay in the Western Allied alliance and not go over to the Nazis. And then the Soviets agreed to attack Japan after the Germans had been defeated. They too were going to concentrate on the defeat of Germany first and then worry about Japan. And really, at this point in time, the Soviet Union is not worrying about Japan at all, whereas the United States and Britain are fighting against Japan. The borders of Germany and Poland were discussed. This becomes a kind of hot topic later on throughout a couple of more meetings that we'll talk about in just a second. Here you have on the far left Joseph Stalin. In the middle is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president, and then on the right, of course, is Churchill. In October of 1944, Churchill went to Moscow, and it's just Churchill and Stalin who are meeting. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is not able to attend or not invited. And Churchill and Stalin meet to discuss more or less spheres of influence in Europe. Britain at this point in time is still thinking that that it is a kind of major player in the world and has an empire to back it up, and therefore Britain could see the Soviet Union, kind of look at them directly in the eyes and talk about what parts of Europe they might want to split up between each of those respective nations. The British wanted to share the Balkans with the Soviet Union. The Soviets were supposed to have more influence in Romania and Bulgaria, and then Britain was supposed to have influence in Greece. I think that really makes sense geographically. It makes sense culturally and things like that. Interest in Britain in Greece and maybe having less of an interest in a country like Bulgaria or Romania. Britain and the Soviet Union were supposed to both have equal influence in Hungary and Yugoslavia. Now, once again, the American president is not invited. Is not really sure what's going on, and thinks that, rightly so, that both Britain and the Soviet Union are, interested in a kind of almost like renewed imperialism, if you will, or spheres of influence. And the United States really isn't into that so much at the time. There were some really profound disagreements between the Western allies, being once again Western capitalist democracies, and the Soviet Union, which is a planned economy and a totalitarian dictatorship. Stalin is really quite interested, this makes sense, in reparations for all of the damage that the Germans caused in their assault on the Soviet Union. They wanted reparations, but they also wanted to force Germans to come to the Soviet Union and work to repair the damage. It isn't just a matter of the Soviet Union getting wealth from the Germans and using that wealth to rebuild. Stalin is a person who has labor camps that are filled with millions of people, and so forced labor is something that seems like a good idea to him. Stalin also wanted friendly Eastern European governments. He wants to create little Soviet unions in Eastern Europe, whereas Roosevelt and Churchill wanted democracy and self-determination, and of course capitalism in Eastern Europe. As I said before, Roosevelt suspected the British and the Soviet Union having plans for different spheres of influence and sort of creating little mini empires, if you will, in different parts of Stalin had an interesting idea that you can imagine would have unsettled both Churchill and Roosevelt. Stalin wanted to shoot somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 German officers. The war had been progressing on the Eastern Front with a lot of people being murdered. A lot of Soviet prisoners of war were being murdered, if you might remember from the previous lecture. And this seems like, to a person like Stalin, this seems like something that you could simply do, that you would execute the German officer corps and thereby leave Germany sort of defenseless without having the officers to ever have another war again, or plan another war and lead another war. I think both Churchill and Roosevelt are probably much more interested in doing things like completely disarming Germany rather than actually murdering people after the war. In February of 1945, there was a meeting at Yalta, which is in the Crimea. Stalin really has the military advantage at this point in time. His troops are really invading Germany at this point in time, and the Soviet Union has a very large land army, and the allies, the Western allies, Britain and the United States, are interested in getting the Soviet Union into the attack against Japan at some point in time. And so the Soviet Union was offered Asian territory for, after the war with Germany is over, attacking Japan. Roosevelt pushes for a renewed League of Nations called the United Nations. The Soviets put a figure on the reparations that they wanted. They wanted $10 billion worth of reparations, or half of whatever was eventually set for the Germans in general. This doesn't seem like a lot of money to us at this point in time, but back then it was really quite a large amount of money. Stalin agrees at this point in time to allow free elections to take place, to allow the people of Eastern Europe to determine for themselves what kind of a country or countries they would like to have. We don't know exactly whether he is being honest about wanting to do this, or if he is just sort of nodding his head and agreeing because the war isn't over and he doesn't want the British and the Americans to drop out of it. Once again, the borders between Russia and Poland and Germany and so on were discussed, and it was thought that both the Russian border would be moved into areas that used to be Polish, and the Polish border would be moved into areas that used to be Germany. And then everybody agreed that Germany would be completely disarmed. It would be denazified. Anybody who had been in power who was a Nazi should be removed from power and never have power in a post-war Germany. And then Germany too would be divided into zones of occupation between the four winners of the war, the fourth winner being France. There are the four occupation zones, more or less. You might see Potsdam there in the red part, and then there is a square just above it. That square is Berlin. So Berlin, which will also be divided into four occupation zones, is in the middle of the territory which is controlled by the Soviet Union. Here they are at Yalta. We've got Churchill on the left and Roosevelt in the middle and Stalin on the right, and they seem to be having a good time. Seems like Roosevelt might be telling a joke or doing a magic trick. Well, there was a lot of discussion about how to deal with Germany after the war, and there was a plan called the Morgenthau Plan, which would be to simply strip Germany of all of its industry at the end of the war, the industry that is that continued to exist after all of the bombing, turn Germany into an agricultural state, and as you know, industrialization is really what creates power that you could use to invade other nations. If Germany remains an agricultural state from here on out, it's going to be impossible for it to be aggressive and attack its neighbors ever again. That doesn't happen, nor is Bismarck's unification of Germany completely undone. There are zones of occupation, yes, but the idea eventually is for Germany to return as a country. So after the war is over in July of 1945, it ends in May of 1945, if you remember, at a place called Potsdam, just outside of Berlin. The big three have changed. It is still, of course, Stalin, but we have a new American president, Harry S. Truman. Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies. He passes away in April of 1945. And then the craziest thing happened at the end of the war in Britain. There was an election, and Winston Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated by the Labour Party. Clement Attlee is the leader of the Labour Party at this point in time, and so Clement Attlee becomes the new prime minister. This might seem really unusual because Churchill does such a masterful job of running a successful war and keeping the British in the fight, but really this is kind of like what happened at the end of World War I, where the British people didn't want a conservative government. They really wanted a land fit for heroes after World War II. In other words, they wanted the social welfare state that the Labour Party was electioneering on. And so people wanted that. They wanted less difference between the rich and the poor, and they wanted people to be taken care of after the war. And so this is why Churchill is defeated. Well, you've got Stalin and you've got Truman and Attlee. It seems to be, and you'll see this in the photograph following this slide, that Stalin seems to be in charge in a way, and Truman and Attlee are kind of at a loss of how to deal with Stalin. He is, he's Stalin, and these two other guys are not. They aren't the same. They don't carry the same weight as a Roosevelt or a Churchill. It was decided at Potsdam that each could take reparations from their own zone as they wished. The Soviets were supposed to get $10 billion worth of reparations from the Western zones. That never actually occurs. And the Soviet and Polish borders were pushed even farther west than what had been discussed earlier, cutting into Germany. The Poles cut into Germany, and the Soviet Union cuts into Poland. It was ordered too that German people or ethnic Germans should be moved out of Eastern Europe, both in this Polish border area, but just really anywhere in Eastern Europe. And that was supposed to be an orderly and humane transfer of Germans. Generally, it was not. Generally, it was kind of a lot of angry Eastern Europeans telling the Germans that they had minutes to leave or they would be killed. So once again, this is about 2 million Germans who leave. Well, actually, it's about 10 million Germans, I'm going to say, 10 million Germans who are forced out of Eastern Europe and then pushed into what becomes East and West Germany eventually. Here are Clement Attlee on the left, and then Harry Truman in the middle, and then Stalin on the right. And well, I think the picture speaks a thousand words. We talked previously about the war crimes that were being committed by the Nazis, and it was decided that there would be a war crimes tribunal, that there would be war crimes trials held in Nuremberg, and the top Nazis of all different kinds, politicians and doctors and judges and so on, people who had been guilty of crimes that I guess, like they call them, crimes against humanity. These aren't there aren't laws on any law book or law code that says that you can't do these things that these Nazis are accused of, but just in terms of being a human being, you would say that these things are wrong. And so this is what the top Nazis are tried for. It is, in some ways, for the Germans, a kind of victor's justice. In other words, the people who win get to try the people who lose. They argue that if the Germans had won the war, they would prosecute the Allies for bombing German cities and so on. But nonetheless, what we have are charges against top Nazis for conspiracy for crimes against peace, planning and waging a war of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Once again, kind of hard to define what that is or what those things are, but a number of people are found guilty for that, and a number of top Nazis were sentenced to death. Many, many more were sentenced to imprisonment. And sadly, though, this is really kind of an embarrassing thing, but in Western Europe or in the areas controlled by the United States and Britain and France and so on, many of the sentences that were passed on top Nazis for life imprisonment, for example, get commuted in the 1950s, and people who had done really, really horrible things are simply set free. And the reason for that, sadly, is because I think the Cold War had broken out, and the United States in particular was maybe less interested in what had happened during the war, and much more interested in confronting the Soviet Union. Here we can talk about how the Soviet Union under Stalin really does do a very thorough job of getting rid of Nazis. They reopened the concentration camps, for example, in Germany, and put Nazis and whoever else Stalin feels is an opponent in these concentration camps like Buchenwald, and they kill a lot of people in who they thought were guilty or really, as I say, just anti-Stalin. Well, there isn't really a peace treaty per se that is signed by Nazi Germany. There are some treaties and reparations that are paid by Axis countries, those who were allied with Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. Countries like Romania and Bulgaria and so on. There is no final peace treaty with Germany because there is no German government. What is created out of the end of the war is Finland and Austria being neutral, and then the rest of Europe really divided between capitalist and communist worlds, and then having an iron curtain, so-called, dividing the two different worlds. So it kind of looks like this. You can see on this map, everything in blue is more or less in the Western sphere at this point in time. The lighter colored countries are neutral. You can see Poland is much greater, and that shaded territory is stuff that was taken from Germany. And then you can also see that the Soviet Union took over quite a bit of Poland. It also takes quite a bit of Romania if you look at that area there too. The United Nations, once again, is kind of a redo of the League of Nations. It's supposed to be a forum to ensure peace and security. There are some members that are much more powerful and given a vote and a seat on the Security Council. This would be the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France, and China, each one of them having a veto over the others in weighty decisions that get made. All countries, though, are represented in the General Assembly, and the Cold War really gets fought in the Security Council of the United Nations. In other words, a war breaks out in Korea, and the United States suggests that the world intervene in Korea to get rid of North Korean aggression. At this point in time, the Soviet Union doesn't know to veto that, and so that does go through, and a coalition does try to join in the Korean War. But generally, what would happen is when the Soviet Union does something that the United States doesn't like, then the United States vetoes whatever their proposal is, and vice versa. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. It was a little bit shorter than they are usually. Please do the reading quiz. Thanks so much. Have a great day.